Greetings and welcome to my new study on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. I hope you enjoy this. We're going to work verse by verse essentially through these two books and hopefully discover what Paul's words can say to us today. This video, though, is going to focus on the background information to the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and paint a little bit of a picture of who the people were that Paul was writing to and kind of what he was in his mind as he was writing the letters that he wrote. To do this, we're going to start in Acts 16 and 17. The book of Acts details some of Paul's adventures and his missionary journeys. And in Acts 16 and 17, Paul and his traveling companion Silas are going through Philippi and Thessalonica, which obviously since we're talking about the letter to the Thessalonians, it is very important to read about Paul's adventures in Thessalonica before he wrote this letter. So Paul came to this region sometime in the late 40s AD. We're not exactly sure when. Some will put this as early as maybe 46, 47, but it could be as late as 49 or even 50 AD. That's the time frame that we're looking at with Paul's journey here. He and Silas come to the region, and they have this habit of stopping at the Jewish locations, these cities, especially Thessalonica, but even Philippi to some degree, had a population of Jews living there. And Paul's habit was to go to that population first to preach the message of Jesus to his Jewish brothers and sisters and to try to win them to the gospel. And so he does that first in Philippi at a place of prayer. A place of prayer was used in a location where there were not enough individuals to form a proper synagogue. So when Acts 16 says Paul and Silas go to the place of prayer, that means they are going to the place where the Jews gathered on Saturdays to worship and to pray. It would have been a designated location, but there were not enough individuals to form a true synagogue, so they called it a place of prayer. In Acts 17, Paul and Silas enter Thessalonica, and the first place that they go is into the synagogue, indicating there is a larger Jewish population in Thessalonica than in Philippi, and that Paul and Silas go to them in this more structured environment of a synagogue for Saturday worship, for the Sabbath day worship, and they attempt to preach the gospel message to these individuals. Now, in both cities, Paul has some success in preaching the gospel, but in both cities, it seems like as much of the success comes from the Gentile community as it does from the Jewish community. In Thessalonica in particular, Paul seems to have more success among the Gentile community, that is the non-Jewish community, than in the Jewish community. And we see that even a few of the prominent women embrace Paul's message. They brought with them wealth and prestige and some civic connection, but these connections would not have been as strong as, say, some of the influential men of the city, but he still makes some inroads. We want to notice also that Paul, when he is staying in Thessalonica, stays with a man named Jason. Now, it is impossible to know for certain, but Jason is a Greek name, not a Jewish name, so it does seem likely that Jason was a Greek or Gentile convert and not a Jewish convert. So what we have is Paul comes to the city. He preaches for a few weeks in the synagogue. He is then no longer welcomed in the synagogue after the leaders hear what he has to say, and they decide that he is not preaching something that they as good Jews can embrace. And so he is disinvited from that worship gathering, and he goes into the Gentile regions and starts preaching, presumably while making tents. He starts talking to his customers and talks to them about Jesus. So he has this following at the time, and because he has this following of predominantly Gentiles, the Jewish leaders seemingly go to the city leaders, and they say this great line, these men who have made trouble around the world have now come here. Just a wonderful line, because what it harkens back to is Paul's relationship in Philippi that we have just read, where he has gone through the city and this slave girl has come up to him and harassed him repeatedly. Her, under the possession of demons, harasses him about his message of the gospel, and Paul exorcises the demons, and because of that is thrown into prison, because that cost the slave girl, her owners, a lot of money, because she would prophesy for their customers, and that made them a great deal of money, and they were obviously upset about this. If you want to read a good fictionalized account of this, I strongly recommend Paula Gooder's Lydia. It tells the story. It tells this story in some detail, but in a fictionalized way, so that you can get a little bit of background on it. But that kind of reputation, where Paul was thrown into prison for causing trouble to the economics of Philippi, followed him. That reputation follows him into Thessalonica, and the Jewish community leads a charge to the city leaders that Paul, who has done all of these things and caused all this trouble everywhere else, has now come to their community where he will likely bring trouble. Now, we see this and we recognize that these are somewhat trumped up charges, but they do stick, they do work, and the people of Thessalonica put pressure on Paul to leave. And so, and part of how they do that is arresting Jason, who Paul is staying with, and holding Jason responsible for Paul. This would have been a common, this is a common enough occurrence in the ancient world where Paul has done something wrong, but because he is under the patronage of Jason, at least as far as the city is concerned, the city holds Jason accountable. Paul and Silas then leave the city, and they go on their journeys, Paul to Athens, and then they later meet up in Corinth, where they spend about 18 months. So some year to 2 years after Paul has left Thessalonica is when he writes this letter. Now, because Paul seems to have left somewhat abruptly, he seems to have left Thessalonica somewhat in a hurried nature. He eventually gets a little concerned for the Thessalonians and sends Timothy back to them. Timothy stays with the Thessalonian church for presumably a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, and then brings a report back to Paul and Silas in Corinth. Now, Paul then, because of the report from Timothy, writes 1 Thessalonians. He writes this with Paul and Silas, who he calls Silvanus, but he is the dominant writer. The way it probably happened was Paul would have a secretary with him. We don't know who that is. There are any number of answers to this question. He might have found a local scribe in Corinth to write down the letter. He might have somebody in his team who was a scribe and could write these letters for him. We're not sure. But what probably happened is he probably sat around and talked with Silas and Timothy and said, what do we need to write? What are the things that we need to say? And then the three of them, and maybe some others, sat and talked and came together on ideas that they had to write about. The three of them being Paul and Silas being the leaders of the group, and then Timothy being probably a junior member, but the one who had the most recent history with the Thessalonian congregations. I say congregations because there might have been 2 or 3 house churches. We're not sure. There was at least one, but there could have been a few more house churches of maybe 30 or 40 individuals who Paul was writing to. This would have been a series, a network of churches in Thessalonica that Paul wrote one letter to address all of the issues that came out of Timothy's conversations. So the 3 of them sat down. Paul, Silas, and Timothy sit down. They brainstorm about what to write, and then Paul sits with the scribe and pens the letter, has the scribe write it while Paul dictates, or maybe loosely dictates, where Paul kind of says, in this paragraph, here's kind of what I want to say, and then lets the scribe pick some exact words. Just like letter writing today can be a little bit fuzzy, letter writing in the first century, what is authorship is still kind of a question that scholars ask. So that's the basic gist of it. Now, Paul has written this letter mostly to encourage the Thessalonians, partially to give them guidance, and with a little bit of critique mixed in. Not a lot of critique, a lot of praise, a lot of compliments. Now, Thessalonica, we should mention, is a leading city in Macedonia. It is a very busy, very wealthy hub for business at the time. It would have been a larger city with a sizable Jewish population, maybe not huge, but at least a sizable enough percentage that Paul felt it was worth his time. This congregation is facing some backlash, presumably some backlash from Paul being run out of town, but it does not seem like they are facing a great deal of persecution. It seems like most of the controversy ended when Paul and Silas left town rather than continuing on after that. Instead, these individuals who make up the church in Thessalonica are they are showing themselves well and being praised in the city. Paul will bring up their reputation here in the first chapter, and we should really, and we'll talk about it a little bit then, we should really contrast this with how Paul's reputation was when he left the town. His encounter with the magistrates is likely on his mind as he is writing this letter. All of these things that he has experienced they're in his mind and playing out as he's writing this letter from Corinth, maybe just a few months after he left. The feeling that I get reading this letter is that Paul went to Athens after spending maybe a month or 2 in Thessalonica. He goes to Athens, and about the time he's leaving Athens, he says to Timothy, hey, go back and check on them and then meet me in Corinth. And so he hasn't been gone that long, and Timothy isn't gone from him very long. The background seems to be that he wants to make sure that the people who he has left are doing just as well as he thinks they are, and they're in the same good position that he left them in. And when Timothy returns and says, yes, and they're maybe doing better than you thought, that warms his heart. And so he wants to write this letter showing appreciation and thanksgiving for them. This potentially is the first letter that Paul wrote that we still have, the first extant letter. It's between this and the book of Galatians. And there are a couple of parallels where we're looking at Galatians and looking at Thessalonians. You kind of see Paul has some similar themes in his writing and what he's thinking about. These two were probably written very close to the same time. Maybe it's just me and my biases that I think Thessalonians was probably written first, but I'm no expert and I could easily be wrong, but they were written very close to the same time, right around that 49-50 mark, where early letters from Paul to his congregations. I noticed these are also some of the shorter letters for Paul. I think he gets more long-winded as he ages, but as we all do, but that's again personal. ideas reading into the text, so take that with a grain of salt. But this is the background, some of the background to this letter. We do want to keep in mind that this is a community that is made up predominantly of Gentiles, that is, non-Jews. They did not grow up in Jewish communities. They're not even necessarily God-fearing individuals. By God-fearers, we mean people who grew up as Greeks or Gentiles that had a strong appreciation for the Jewish ideas and the Jewish way of life and the Jewish religion, and so gave a lot of credence to that. These were not necessarily people who were in that position. These are people who heard Paul and heard what he had to say and believed him. They are also fairly wealthy individuals, so we should recognize that they're when we read about this, that Paul is writing to a wealthy community that has at least a few very wealthy patrons who are some of the leading individuals, if they are women, still leading individuals of the community with some clout and some influence. So all of that hopefully gives you some background to at least First Thessalonians. And if you have questions or comments, please let me know. I'd love to answer more questions if they come up. And that goes throughout this study. Please ask your questions because I like to deal with them and I like to learn from you. So if you learn something about First Thessalonians, please drop me a comment and let me know what's going on in your world as you study this book, and we can study and learn it together. And until we meet again, God bless.